Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have a really exciting project for you. We're going to make a lightweight sweater using a circular knitting machine. This is perfect for spring or layering in cooler weather. This is my first knitting machine tutorial, so I'm gonna go through some simple explanation about the machine, as well as some tips and tricks for good tension and smooth working. You can use the timestamps below to jump ahead or back. I'd say this tutorial is beginner friendly, but you still need to know the basics of crocheting, such as how to make a single crochet and waving the ends. This is what you'll need: an Addi or Sentro circular knitting machine, lightweight yarn. I recommend using a soft breathable yarn for a comfortable fit. I've used around 2.5 skeins of Fruta from Hobby in colorway 03. It's a degradé 100% Turkish cotton and I highly recommend it. It's so soft and smooth, almost silky, and my knitting machine loves it. I will leave you some information down below. Scrap yarn. I'd recommend 4 pieces of scrap yarn of different colors, measuring around 10 yards each, to be able to cast on and off 4 or 5 rows. Choose colors that are different from your main yarn. Scissors, a yarn needle, a 4mm crochet hook, a tape measure, stitch markers. I'm using my Addi knitting machine, which has 46 pins. If you use a Sentro knitting machine, you'll have 48 pins, so the final result will be slightly larger. These are the final measurements of my sweater. Due to the nature of the fabric and the knitting work, the sweater will loosen up over time, so I've included the measurements both immediately after completion and after a few wearings. Unfortunately, I'm not experienced enough with my knitting machine to propose a solution for sizes larger than an M, as the panels are made at their maximum width allowed by the pins. A potential solution would be to make 4 panels and sew them together in the middle to get a larger variation, but I'm not sure how it would look aesthetically. It might look much nicer in a dark color, so the seam would not be visible. I might dive deeper into this topic in future tutorials. Make sure your knitting machine is on a stable surface. My Addi machine comes with table clamps that allow me to keep it stable on the table while I work. If you use a Sentro, you should have suction cups under the feet of your machine. The knitting machine has a few components, which are the needle, cylinder or body, is the central part of the machine that holds the needles. The cylinder rotates to enable circular or flat knitting. Needles are also called pins and are arranged around the cylinder. These needles catch and pull the yarn to form the stitches. Yarn guide, a mechanism that guides the yarn to the needles so that they can pick up the yarn correctly and knit it into stitches. Unlike the Sentro machine, the Addi machine has just one small tension guide that adjusts the tension of the yarn being fed into the machine. It's this hole here, and I use it alongside my hand placement to change tension. Counter, a built-in row counter that keeps track of the number of rows knitted. The handle or crank is used to manually rotate the needle cylinder, moving the needles through the knitting process. You also have a switch that toggles between plain knitting and circular knitting. Circular knitting means the machine works non-stop in a round without changing direction, while the flat setting allows you to knit flat panels by knitting back and forth. The number one trick I learned from knitting and reading discussions online is to add a small silicone patch to the base of your tension dial. I promise you it helps a lot with preventing dropped stitches. I use a regular earplug which you can purchase in any pharmacy. My second tip is to work slowly. I know it's amazing to crank fast and finish a project quickly, but if you work slowly, you'll notice any issues and ensure everything works smoothly. So don't rush, especially when you're working at the edges of flat panels. Keep the tension in a way that is not too tight but not too loose either. I like to hold the yarn very lightly with my thumb and 2 fingers and rest my hand on top of the machine to sustain the weight. Essentially, I just guide the yarn rather than forcing it. Once your machine is stable on a surface, it's time to cast on. Make sure the machine is set to plain knitting mode as we'll work on the 2 body panels. I like to begin any project with scrap yarn, which means your project will have a temporary edge that can be easily removed later for a cleaner finish. So grab your scrap yarn, making sure it's long enough to crank at least 4 or 5 rows, so approximately I would say 10 yards. Choose a scrap yarn that is a different color from your main yarn to make it easier to distinguish and remove later. To cast on, crank until you reach the 3 black needles. If you are using a Sentro machine, crank until the white pin. Reset the row counter to 0. We'll begin the first row by casting on from the first white needle here on the left. On the Sentro, start at the first pink pin after the white one. Keep a tail facing towards the inside of the machine and start by manually wrapping the scrap yarn around the first needle. Using the handle to crank, skip the next needle and wrap the yarn around the third needle. Continue this process, wrapping the yarn around every other needle, alternating going in front and behind the needles all the way around. Make sure the yarn is properly caught by each needle's hook to form the initial loops. Go slowly to properly cast on. With time, you'll be able to cast on faster like I do here. Once you arrive at the very last white pin, the last pink pin on your Sentro, your row is complete. Here I'm going all the way around up to the last black pin just to show you what the machine does. Insert the yarn into the yarn guide and continue in the other direction. Keep your yarn fairly loose in your hand and start cranking in the other direction. You'll notice that the last 2 needles are actually useless because the machine skips them. Continue all the way up to the other side. Once you arrive at the last white stitch, go up to the first black pin and then change direction. Make sure the yarn passes underneath this bridge here. This was the number 1 mistake I used to make in the past, and ensuring the yarn wraps around the bridge before beginning to crank in the other direction will give your panel a nice edge. Always go slower at the end of the row and make sure the yarn wraps around before starting in the other direction. Again, we arrive at the first black pin, the white pin in the Sentro, and you'll see that the machine will drop that stitch too, leaving a tag. Again, make sure the yarn wraps around this bridge here. Also, make sure the first pin hooks the yarn and continue working. After a few rows of scrap yarn, it's time to use the main yarn. Once you arrive at the black pin or the white pin on your Sentro, open the yarn guide and drop the current yarn, leaving it in the center of the machine. And insert the main yarn into the yarn guide, leaving a long tail in the middle. Close the yarn guide and, if you'd like, make a loose knot to secure the new yarn to the old one. This step is optional but helps keep the new yarn in place. Reset your row counter to 0 and crank in the other direction very slowly. You'll see the machine will skip those black pins and get hooked into the first white pin. If you accidentally skip a pin, as I did here, you can fix the problem by pushing the yarn to get hooked by the pin and continue. This is why I said to go slow. If you run out of yarn mid-row, here's a quick demonstration of how to change yarn. Open the yarn guide and leave the tail in the center. Take the new yarn, place it in the same spot and guide it through the yarn guide. Make a loose knot and continue working as usual. This is safe and secure. Keep working this way for a total of 96 rows. I chose this length because it suits how I usually dress. It's going to be around 18 inches long, but keep in mind that this kind of knitted fabric will be really stretchy, so it will get longer after a few uses. The stretchiness will change depending on your yarn as well. After wearing my sweater a few times and measuring it, I discovered it was around 20 inches long, so add or remove rows accordingly to your desired length. Once you reach your desired length, cut a very long piece of yarn, around 20 inches. Open the yarn guide and push the yarn into the center of the machine. Substitute the main yarn with another scrap yarn and make a loose knot if you want. Crank 3 or 4 rows with the scrap yarn. Remove the yarn from the guide and we are now ready to cast off. To cast off with the scrap yarn, simply crank in the other direction without yarn. This way the pins will push the last row of stitches up. Crank without yarn for one more round in the other direction to detach the panel from the machine. Take the panel off. If you measure the panel right now, With all the curling, it would measure around 15 inches. Make another panel in the exact same way. Now we are ready to make the edge and secure the finishing. To do so, we'll use a 4mm crochet hook. What we are going to do is crochet a single crochet edge all around our panels. Here I already work on one of my panels and you can see it's all nice and tidy. So grab your panel and identify the cast on scrap yarn and the cast off one. If you change yarn mid-row, go to the spot and make a tight double knot so it will not be visible on the right side of the work. Find the main yarn tail on the last row of your panel and you'll notice there are the main yarn stitches and then the scrap yarn you use to cast off. Take the yarn tail and prepare to crochet. Insert the hook into the very first loop next to the working yarn and make a chain. Turn your work so you can work from right to left and identify those stitches we were talking about. Insert your hook into those stitches to make a single crochet edge. They should be really easy to spot because the scrap yarn is of a different color compared to the main yarn. Work fairly loose so it will be easier later. Continue working single crochet stitches across, making sure not to skip any loop. If you run out of yarn like me, join a new piece of yarn using your preferred method. I like the magic knot method and I make sure the little knot lays on the back side of my panel. Once you arrive at the last stitch, pull up the loop and remove the crochet hook. Now pull the scrap yarn to unravel it. As we begin from the cast off section, it should be pretty easy to frog and wind up again into a tiny cake for the next use. Now we continue down the side of the work. Chain 1, make 1 single crochet into the same place and 1 single crochet into each stitch. The stitches are these loops here. Where you see a hole, place a single crochet. Once you arrive at the bottom corner, you should have the other scrap yarn. Chain 1, make 1 single crochet into the same stitch and start inserting 1 single crochet into every loop as seen previously. Once you arrive at the last loop, you should find the yarn tail you left previously. Pull that tail through the working loop and pull to secure, then continue working with your usual yarn. Chain 1, make 1 single crochet into the same stitch, pull up the loop and remove the hook. You need to remove the scrap yarn, but this time it will be a little harder. What I find is the best solution is to find the yarn tail and pull a little until you get to where the yarn comes from and unravel that, as you can see me doing. This is the only method I found that allows me to unravel the scrap yarn instead of cutting it. So be patient because you need to do that just up to a point where the yarn will come out easily, as happened on the other side. Again, chain 1, make 1 single crochet into the same stitch and continue with 1 single crochet into every row down the panel. Once you arrive at the beginning, chain 1 and slip stitch into the first stitch. Cut a long piece of yarn and fasten off. Repeat the same process for the other panel. Once you have made a single crochet edge all around both panels, it's time to seam the top of the panels to leave room for the head. Lay the panels one above the other with the right sides facing each other. Count 10 stitches from the left corner and place a stitch marker, and do the same for the right corner. Count 10 stitches and place a stitch marker. The head passage should be around 7 inches. It's going to be really stretchy, so I found that measurement nice to achieve a nice looking final result. Thread the yarn tail into a needle and pass it through the other side in the corner stitch. Re-enter through the same stitch where your yarn tail comes from to secure. Keep both panels aligned like a sandwich and pass the needle through the external loop on both sides, going from inside out like lacing a shoe. You need to go through the farthest loop from you and the closest one to you. Seam the panels together, making sure the stitches match on both sides until you get to the stitch marker. Here, re-enter into the last matching stitches and make a knot to secure. Wave in the end afterward. If you turn the panel inside out, you'll see how tidy and neat the right side looks like. Repeat the same thing for the other side. Next, we'll work on the sleeves. Turn the switch down to circular knitting, so we'll continue cranking in one direction all around. Reset the row counter to 0. This time we'll begin casting on from the first black needle after the white one, so the white needle on a Sentro. Take your scrap yarn and cast on as seen previously. Once you arrive at the last pin, the white pin on an Addi and the pink pin on a Sentro, make sure to wrap the yarn around this bridge here before inserting it in the yarn guide. We basically pass the yarn in the same spot where the beginning tail is. Continue cranking until you get to 4 or 5 rows. Once you arrive at the last pin, open the yarn guide and push the scrap yarn into the center of the machine. Substitute the old yarn with the main one and make a loose knot if you want. Rotate the counter to set it to 0 and crank a total of 95 rows with the main yarn. The final sleeves will be around 21 inches once finished and around 25 inches after wearing the sweater a few times. So if you'd like shorter sleeves, remove a few rows. After a while, you'll notice that the project starts to fall on itself inside the machine, which might be problematic for the tension. What I like to do is wrap it around itself so the tension is not compromised. Once you get to the right amount of rows for your desired length, leave the yarn attached to the skein, open the yarn guide and push the yarn into the center of the machine. Substitute the main yarn with another scrap yarn and make a loose knot if you want. Crank 3 or 4 rows with the scrap yarn. Remove the yarn from the guide and we are now ready to cast off. Crank 2 rows without yarn to push the last rows of stitches up and detach the panel from the machine. Take the tube out. Make another sleeve in the exact same way. What we are going to do now is crochet a single crochet edge all around our tube like we have done for the body panels. Grab your tube and identify the cast-on scrap yarn and the cast-off one. If you change yarn mid-row, go to that spot and make a tight double knot so it won't be visible on the right side of the work. Find the main yarn tail on the last row of your tube, so the cast-off side. Insert the hook into the very first loop next to the working yarn and make a chain. Turn your work so you can work from right to left and identify those stitches we were talking about. Insert your hook into those stitches to make a single crochet edge as seen previously. Continue working single crochet stitches across, making sure not to skip any loop. Once you arrive at the last stitch, slip stitch into the first stitch of the round. Pull up the loop and remove the crochet hook. Now pull the scrap yarn to unravel it. Again, it should be pretty easy to frog as this is the cast off side. Now we'll add a decorative edge to the sleeve, and to do that I chose the crab stitch. Chain 1 and turn your work so that you are working on the right side of your sleeve and into the wrong side of the single crochet edge you just worked. Enter into the first stitch as you would work a regular single crochet, but before closing the stitch, twist your wrist in a clockwise motion. Keep your work quite loose so you won't need to push too hard through the twisted loops. Again, insert your hook into the next stitch as you would to work a regular single crochet, but before closing the stitch, twist your wrist in a clockwise motion. Continue this way until the last stitch. Cut the yarn and pull the tail through. Now thread it onto a needle and finish off the seam by inserting the needle through the first stitch of the round from front to back and into the last stitch from back to front. Go back into the first stitch from front to back and wave in the end afterward. Find the main yarn tail on the other side, so the cast-on side. Again, insert the hook into the very first loop next to the working yarn and make a chain. Turn your work so you can work from right to left. And again, insert your hook into these loops to make a single crochet edge like done for the other side. After the last stitch, slip stitch into the very first stitch, cut the yarn and fasten off. Now pull the scrap yarn to unravel it. This is the side we'll seam onto the shoulder. Repeat the same procedure for the other sleeve. As previously mentioned, now my sleeves are around 21 inches long, but they'll get to 25 inches after wearing the sweater a few times. Turn the sleeves inside out and fold the body of the top with the wrong sides facing outwards. Now, considering that the single crochet edge does not have the same distance on the sleeves and the side of the panel, we'll rely on using a tape measure and linking both sides so that it matches, rather than counting the single stitches. Fold the sleeve in half, keeping the long tail facing down. The sleeves is around 9 inches wide. And place a stitch marker at the top and at the bottom, making sure it matches the top of the shoulder and the bottom, where the armpit will be. Place the stitch marker to match the sleeve stitch markers on both front and back panels, as shown in the video. Thread the yarn tail into a needle and begin sewing the sleeves as shown for the shoulder seam. Pass it through the other side in the corresponding stitch, going through both loops. And then, keeping both panels aligned like a sandwich, pass the needle through the external loop on both sides, going from inside out like lacing a shoe. You need to go through the furthest loop from you and the closest one to you. Seam the panels together, making sure the stitches match on both sides until you get to the stitch marker. As previously explained, one side will have more stitches than the other side. So what I do is always check that the panels match and sometimes seam 2 stitches on one side to 1 stitch on the other side. Continue seaming until the top stitch marker and then continue down to the other side until the beginning. Once you're done with the sleeves, you can continue seaming down on the side of the sweater. Here the stitches will match perfectly because we work in the same way on both sides, so match every stitch with the corresponding one on the other side. If you turn the right side facing out, you'll see how neat and tidy the final seam looks. Repeat the same thing for the other side. Wave in all the remaining tails, turn the right side facing out, and you are done. I'm really happy with the final result. The fabric is so soft and silky, I can't stop touching it. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions or if you'd like more videos about how to work with a knitting machine. I would be really happy to record more videos. Don't forget to tag me Bloodimaryart on your social media if you post about this design. Again, thanks so much for watching and see you next time.